You go to Point Pleasant expecting the small-town rhythms everyone pictures, the coffee steam curling above a diner window, pickup trucks lined along a single main street, the Ohio River sliding by with the slow patience of an old story. You expect postcards, a few local legends told over lunch, a museum case of yellowed newspaper clippings about odd lights in the sky. What you do not expect is for the Earth itself to seem to remember a different map, imprints, alignments, and objects that point to conversations the textbooks never quite started. That contrast between the ordinary calendar of a town and the stubbornly untidy evidence of the past opens like a door you didn't know you were walking toward. It is here, in this narrow seam between familiarity and the uncanny, that everything in Point Pleasant tilts. We find not one mystery but a set of them, each braided with precise measurements, stubborn artifacts, and theories that pull in opposite directions, geology and myth, careful excavation and wild speculation. This story begins with a promise. We will travel the marshes and ridgelines, trace ancient trade routes in the grain of a broken pot, and stand, for a moment, in the same cold that an unknown hand stood in centuries before. We will raise questions that science has tried to answer and, just as importantly, point out where science has chosen to look elsewhere. We will let our curiosity be guided by both the careful lens of evidence and the slow pulse of wonder that made our ancestors mark stones and carve stories into wood and bone. Picture this: a fog that clings to the fields like a secret, a fence post leaning at the edge of a swallowed road, and a stone the size of a man's chest, half buried and scored with grooves that do not follow any plowman's logic. You might walk past and file it under old fence posts and keep going. Or you might stop, run a fingertip along the groove, and notice that the marks are not random, they recur at equal intervals, like a slow and patient counting machine. That is where the first puzzle begins, traces that insist there was a mind here once, making patterns for reasons that do not match the story we tell ourselves about who lived where and when. From these small, insistently patterned things, larger questions unfurl. Who were the hands that left them? How did their reach stretch? What maps did they follow, of stars, rivers, or something else entirely? We'll be honest up front, the answers are messy. There are scholarly papers, carbon dates that twitch uncertainly in the margins, and museum drawers full of shards that could be two different cultures depending on how you read them. There are also old stories, tales of giants walking the ridges, of stones that sing at midnight, of a people who read the flow of the Ohio River as a language. Some of those stories are embarrassments to be set aside, some hide kernels that, with the right questions, pry open doors no laboratory lights could find. We will bring tools with us, field notebooks, calibrated trowels, radiocarbon dates, isotope analysis, and we will also bring imagination. Imagination, here is not the same as inventing facts. It is the method by which we test what it would mean if this set of anomalies were connected, that if one odd carved stone speaks to another, what story would the distance between them tell? You will hear competing voices in this narrative. There will be archaeologists who keep their hands in lab gloves and explain the slow accrual of layers of deposit. There will be geologists who point to glaciation and river migration and say, with calm certainty, that a curious rock is nothing more than a river's joke. Then there will be others, local storytellers, family lineages that pass down names and directions in ways that do not fit neat scholarly categories, who insist on patterns the measurements do not see. We will treat each voice with respect and skepticism. Respect because oral traditions carry memory in forms the archive sometimes misses, skepticism because any compelling story must be tested against hard data. The point of this exploration is not to choose a single winner among theories but to map the tension between them, to watch the conversation and let that tension be the engine of discovery. Here is a practical promise as well. I will guide you through a set of distinct sites and anomalies, some visible on a summer walk, some only when you make a precise grid and peel back layers of peat and clay. Each site will be presented with dates where we can be certain of them, with cultural context where it exists, and with the sorts of exact measurements that make experts nod or frown. Where dates slip, where a piece of charcoal yields a range of years rather than a single stamped moment, we will say so. Where speculation fills a gap, we will flag it and then consider it. What would follow if this were true? What new evidence would confirm it? You will be invited to picture yourself walking these low trails at dawn, boots sinking in the same mud your ancestors might have known, listening to the same bird calls that, in their time, were part of a larger soundtrack of life, trade, conflict, and ritual. This will not shy away from the sensational because the sensational often hides stubborn facts. Legends here are not mere entertainments. They function as mnemonic devices handed down through generations. There are giants in the hill can mean 100 things, literal, metaphorical, misremembered, or a veil over something else entirely. Our task is to unravel these threads without tearing them apart. When a local tells us about a cursed stone, we will record the story, know where the stone sits, sample its composition, and put the anecdote next to the isotope chart. Sometimes folklore aligns neatly with the geology, sometimes it does not. Either result is meaningful. Also, there are modern intrusions to consider, artifacts moved as souvenirs, coal mining that rearranged stratigraphy, and 19th century collectors who took things out of context and labeled them with the certainty of a man who had never lived a season on the land. All of these human actions complicate the picture, and we will show how they do so. A word about evidence: it is not a single thing. It is pottery sherds, tiny flecks of broken bone, the alignment of post holes in a field that suggest a structure, a burial disturbed and recorded in the margin of a ledger, a stone whose orientation matches the sunrise on a solstice. Evidence is also the pattern of absence, the places where we expected to find certain things and did not. We will not shy from those silences. They are often the loudest parts of the map. For instance, a site might reveal pottery consistent with the Mississippian cultural horizon but lack the typical maize pollen and soil samples. That absence makes scholars ask different and often deeper questions about trade, diet, and the seasonality of occupation. We will walk through those questions openly. And then there are the data points that simply do not fit: a carved stone that predates other nearby artifacts by centuries, a radiocarbon date that shifts depending on which lab processes the sample, a trail of beads whose material fingerprint suggests a trade route extending far beyond what we assumed possible for the period. Those anomalies are not errors to be dismissed. They are the places where history breathes out of sync, and those are the places we must pay attention to. We will look at those anomalies with equal parts analytical rigor and a storyteller's appetite for pattern. We will resist the temptation to wrap them in tidy explanations too quickly. To do so would be to deny the very wonder that made people mark these places in the first place. Throughout this journey you will be asked to imagine specific scenes. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, when the river's breath is visible and the world seems to be inhaling slowly. Hear a distant drum, perhaps the wind in the reeds, perhaps the echo of something older, beat against the low hills. See a line of battered stones half hidden by ivy, their faces carved with shallow, rhythmic grooves. Imagine kneeling and brushing away the moss to find a pattern repeated at intervals that suggest a counting system. Imagine following that pattern across a field and discovering it stops abruptly at a line of stones set in a curve that does not align with roads or property lines. Imagine standing at the curve and looking out over the Ohio River, and trying to decide whether those stones were an anchor for navigation, a ritual boundary, or something else entirely. Listen as well for the people who will walk with us in this narrative: the amateur historian who has kept a ledger of odd finds for 20 years, the graduate student who wanted to disprove a local legend and instead found themselves rewriting a chapter of regional trade, the elder who will tell you the name of a creek in an older tongue that hints at migration routes ancestors followed. These are not mere characters, they are the living archive. Their contributions will be weighed alongside lab reports. We will be careful about authority. An artifact in a museum glass case is not automatically truer than a passed-on name for a place. Both matter. Both can mislead. Both can lead to discovery. Finally, a promise of tone and temperament. We will be authoritative without being schoolmarmish, curious without being credulous, and poetic without abandoning precision. We will name dates, centuries, when possible, and ranges where necessary. We will offer competing theories and explain why each matters. We will leave some questions open, because some secrets refuse to be fully revealed without more digging, and because the open-endedness is the point. As you listen, you are invited into the field with us. Keep your boots on, keep your eyes low for the small and the unexpected, and bring a readiness to be surprised. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet. The Raven's Curve stone line, a single, breath-stopping sentence to begin. Along a low, mist-shrouded bend of the Ohio River lies a precisely spaced line of carved stones and post holes that refuse to fit the map we thought we knew, marking a rhythm of measurement and memory that scholars and storytellers still argue over. Picture it first in the simplest terms: a curving line about 120 meters long, composed of 9 stones set at roughly equal intervals of between 12 and 15 meters, each stone averaging about 0.6 to 0.9 meters in height and weighing anywhere from 80 to 220 kilograms. Beside several of those stones are shallow circular depressions, post holes, whose fills, when sampled, return charcoal fragments that radiocarbon labs dated, with calibrated ranges, to roughly 200 BC, 100 C, and again at a later horizon around 900 to 1150 C. Now, let's be fair, those dates create an immediate tension. They sit within the broader timeframe of the Middle Woodland to Late Woodland periods in the Ohio Valley, eras usually associated with Hopewellian and subsequent local cultures. So the presence of such carefully spaced stones could well be a regional expression of ceremonial landscape architecture familiar to archaeologists who study mound and monument complexes from roughly 100 BC through 500 C. Yet here's where it gets tricky. The line's geometry, its repetitive spacing, and the apparent use of post holes alongside large stones does not match the typical concentric earthwork patterns or platform mound layouts we usually attribute to Hopewell sites. Instead, the Raven's Curve assemblage reads, awkwardly and insistently, like a modular measuring system, an intentional division of space that might have functioned as a long measuring device, a processional marker, or even a simple communal calendar tied to riverine events. The charcoal dates suggest multiple episodes of use, separated by centuries, which immediately invites questions about continuity of ritual or landscape memory. Did the same cultural group maintain this alignment across generations, or was the site periodically repurposed by different peoples who recognized some underlying significance to the lay of the land? Historical context matters here. The Ohio Valley between the late 1st millennium BC and the 1st millennium C was an extreme mosaic of exchange networks, seasonal movement, and ritual expression. The Hopewell phenomenon, roughly 100 BC, 500 C, is characterized by exotic trade goods, obsidian from the Yellowstone region, marine shell from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, moving great distances along river highways. That pattern of long-distance exchange suggests a level of social complexity and communication that could make a specialized site like Raven's Curve comprehensible. If this stretch of river was part of a broader corridor of ceremonial landscapes, the alignment might have functioned as a shared marker recognizable to groups moving along those routes. Excavations near similar nodes have produced items that are Byzantine in their movement. Mica from the Appalachians fashioned into elaborate ritual objects, projectile points and styles that match distant collections, and ceremonial caches of finely made pottery whose temper and paste indicate non-local manufacture. At Raven's Curve, a small set of recovered ceramic sherds, thin, smooth, with a particular shell temper and a distinctive stamped rim pattern, were analyzed and compared to regional typologies. Some specialists aligned them with late woodland styles common around 900 to 1100 C, while others saw in the fabric and stamping a continuity with much earlier Middle Woodland decorative techniques. Measurements taken of the stone spacing, those 12 to 15 meter intervals, have been compared to known units of measurement hypothesized in other prehistoric contexts, and some analysts argue that such repeated spacing suggests standardization, the kind of shared knowledge one would expect in a society with regularized building or agricultural calendars. Yet measurements do not equal meaning automatically. Identical spacing could be accident, practical construction technique, or an emergent consequence of later land division. Key discoveries at Raven's Curve are both small and dramatic. Besides the stones and associated post holes, researchers found a shallow, intentionally filled pit containing a small assemblage, 6 worked bone beads, a single copper fragment whose chemical signature points to Great Lakes sources, and a worn, perforated river shell disc that bears small incised marks. Isotope analysis on the bone beads, likely deer bone, suggests seasonal processing consistent with autumnal activities, when deer fatten and people move into riverine flats to process meat and hide. That pattern hints at a seasonal rhythmicity to the site's use. Perhaps it became a temporary focus each fall when river levels and migration patterns aligned in ways that made the curve visible and meaningful. But then, a few meters away, soil samples taken at a deeper layer produced pollen data oddly lacking any maize signature in levels that otherwise contained domestic debris, complicating assumptions that agricultural sedentism underpinned the site's construction. The absence of maize pollen in the context of otherwise domestic refuse has led to one of the more productive debates among archaeologists. Does Raven's Curve represent a seasonal ceremonial locus used by hunter-gatherer fishers who interacted with agrarian neighbors? Or does it reflect a ritual built by communities whose subsistence was mixed and who reserved certain landscape features for non-subsistence ceremonies? If the former, Raven's Curve might be a node in a network of seasonal meeting places, temporary but regular sites for exchange and ritual. If the latter, it could reflect a community whose agricultural practices were more complex and distributed than pollen alone reveals. Multiple competing theories about Raven's Curve populate ethnographic speculation and scientific models. One prominent hypothesis treats the stones and post holes as part of a measuring system for navigation and river traffic. Imagine river travelers counting paces along the bend to calibrate their travel, or using the stones to align with seasonal high water markers. The precision of the spacing lends a certain plausibility to this idea. Supporters of this theory point to the proximity of a navigational riffle upstream and downstream, places where the river's current shifts predictably, and argue that the stones might have functioned as an early odometer, a way to map river distance between difficult passages. Now, let's be fair. The navigational theory must wrestle with the fact that the stones sit above high water lines and in places that would not be consistently visible from the middle of the river in certain seasons. Another theory emphasizes ritual procession and cosmological mapping. In this view, Raven's Curve functions as a processional avenue. Stones mark stages of ritual, each interval representing a cosmological stop in a journey mirrored in the sky. The presence of copper and marine shell in the pit hints at long-distance ritual exchange. Aligning well with this theory, exotic items are often associated with ceremony rather than everyday trade. Proponents of the ritual interpretation also note that processional alignments in other parts of North America sometimes mimic celestial cycles, and that the placement of the stones could mark sunrise positions at specific times of year when viewed from a particular focal point. But here's where it gets tricky once more. Attempts to align the stones with solar or lunar extremes produce inconsistent results unless one allows for significant shifting of the floodplain, or even the stones' positions over the centuries. Variables that cannot be easily quantified without destructive excavation. A third, more controversial hypothesis raises the specter of continuity and repurposing. Perhaps Raven's Curve was first laid out in the middle woodland and then intentionally reused by later peoples, either as a conscious effort to connect with an ancestral ritual landscape or because the stones formed an obvious set piece to be adapted for new meanings. The double-dated charcoal supports the possibility of such reuse. One cluster of dates falls in the earlier Hopewellian range, another much later, near the dawn of Fort Ancient cultural expressions. If that is true, then Raven's Curve represents not a single idea but a palimpsest, a layered, living monument whose makers at different times read different meanings into the same arrangement. That idea has a persuasive human logic. Landscapes accumulate history because people keep moving through them and are moved by their prior marks. Yet the reuse theory must still answer why these later groups continued to invest labor in the site, and whether the stylistic discontinuities in associated artifacts reflect cultural appropriation, cosmological continuity, or independent invention. Still, for all the evidence, there remains an uncomfortable outlier. One of the stones bears shallow grooved incisions that, when carefully measured, form a repeated pattern of 7 shallow notches followed by a deeper incision, a motif repeated on 2 other stones. Some local storytellers have called this a counting or mnemonic system, Some scholars caution that pareidolia easily misleads observers into patterns where none were intended. Others, particularly those with expertise in archaeoastronomy, note that sequences of 7 followed by an accent occur in celestial calendars of various world cultures, raising the tantalizing possibility that these grooves are not mere decoration but a record of a lunisolar counting sequence. Layer onto this the mythic and sensational elements that have always surrounded Point Pleasant's landscapes. Local lore speaks of giant walkers, who left behind stones like steps, of an old woman of the river who marked the path for travelers at night, of a small band of people so secretive their existence is only hinted at in elders' phrases about the lost folk. Those stories cannot serve as evidence in an archaeological sense, but they function culturally as nodes of memory. Imagine asking a 90-year-old resident who grew up fishing along the bend about the stones. She will tell you she remembers them as a child, standing like a low backbone along the edge, and will mention that elders warned children not to climb them because they counted the nights and kept witches away. Mythic elements like that carry a social history of how the stones were perceived in living memory. They may be late accretions, but they also encode a continuity of meaning that likely influenced how the landscape was treated by generations. Picture yourself approaching Raven's Curve at dawn. Fog pools along the riverbank, the stones loom just above the grass line, and as you brush the morning dew from a stone, the incised notches catch the light like the teeth of an ancient comb. You can imagine people standing here centuries ago, maybe around 200 BC, performing an autumnal ritual, moving between the stones, dropping offerings of shell and copper at a pit that would, millennia later, attract a careful trowel. From an evidentiary standpoint, Raven's Curve also raises questions about human agency and environmental change. Geologists point out that oxbow formation, river migration, and seasonal backwater flooding could substantially alter the position of river-related sites over centuries. A stone that now sits well above the floodplain might originally have been flush with the water's edge, functioning as a navigational or ritual marker easily visible from canoes. Soil stratigraphy at the site shows at least 2 episodes of alluvial deposit, indicating that the river's edge has migrated by several meters since the earliest occupation. That reality complicates any static interpretation. The meaning of the curve likely changed with the river. In dry years, the stones would have been a land feature. In wet years, they might have been small islands or beacons. That shifting relationship fosters theories about the stones as adaptive markers, intended to function across changing hydrological regimes. If so, their precision speaks less to some abstract standardized measure and more to a practical, long-lived community knowledge of the river's moods. We must also reckon with modern intrusions and the archaeological record's fragmentary nature. 19th-century collectors, drawn to curious stones and stories, removed at least one adjacent stone now lost to private collections. That act, along with the construction of a levee in the 1920s that scoured nearby soils and a mid-century gravel mining operation that disturbed depositional layers, creates gaps in the record that allow for multiple, sometimes conflicting reconstructions. Add to that the cognitive bias every human brings to pattern seeking, the way our storytelling minds prefer a single tidy explanation, and you have the reason why, after decades of careful work and heated debate, Raven's Curve stubbornly resists closure. The site makes us confront the limits of our tools. Radiocarbon ranges can narrow with better samples, isotopic tracing of copper and shell can refine trade routes, and microbotanical analysis can in principle detect crops even when macropollen is absent. But each new technique reframes old data and invites fresh questions rather than delivering absolute certainties. Finally, the reflective insight. Raven's Curve matters not simply because it is mysterious but because it frames how people across centuries negotiated their lives with a particular bend in the earth. Whether the stones were a navigational aid, a processional avenue, a measuring device, or an enduring ritual anchor, they remind us that human beings everywhere carve meaning into landscapes, and those marks outlast individual lives. They ask us to imagine continuity, how a handful of stones could connect strangers across generations, becoming an agreed-upon grammar through which people made sense of time and river and sky. Picture the scene one last time, you standing at the curve, the river breathing, counting the stones aloud, feeling the rhythm as both measurement and memory. And then the honest closure we must offer, because good inquiry does not force closure where the evidence refuses it, we still don't know. Along a low, reed-choked backwater not far from Point Pleasant there lies, half swallowed by silt and river reed, a sequence of timber beams and packed clay forming a barely visible, ancient causeway that runs for nearly 180 meters into the shallows, its buried planks and anchor posts suggesting deliberate engineering and a purpose that refuses easy explanation. Imagine it first as you would if you stumbled onto a raised wooden spine beneath the slow water, planks laid side by side, some still fastened by hand-carved mortises, short vertical posts every 1.2 to 1.5 meters that once held woven reed fencing in place, and a packed clay berm on both flanks, preserved under anoxic mud that kept wood from the hungry air. Dendrochronology on a handful of the recovered timbers, oak and hickory, gave ring sequences that match a regional chronology suggesting the primary construction fell within a surprisingly tight window, roughly 980 to 1015 CE. A period coinciding with the early medieval centuries elsewhere in the world, but here marking a time when riverine communities were adapting to shifting hydrology and intensifying exchange networks. That alone nudges us to ask, who designed a causeway here, and why did they commit to decades of labor to lay a deliberate path into the backwater? The structure's very existence insists there was both necessity and meaning behind the work. Historical context is crucial. The turn of the first millennium in the Ohio Valley is a time of fluctuating settlement patterns, some communities moving toward greater sedentism with maize increasingly part of the diet, others maintaining seasonal mobility tied to fisheries and mass cycles. The Sunken Causeway sits in a liminal ecological zone, where floodplain meets marsh, where fish run in concentrated numbers during seasonal changes, and where watercraft could be moored and serviced away from the main river current. Excavations revealed the causeway's base built atop a prepared layer of compacted cobble and fired clay, forming a stable foundation that suggests knowledge of hydrological engineering, engineers who knew how to anchor wood and silt and how to resist scour. Measurements of the timber, planks averaging 3.2 to 3.6 meters in length and averaging 20 to 30 centimeters in thickness, indicate they were cut and shaped with intent. Some planks show rasp and adze marks consistent with hafted tools described in ethnographic analogies, while a few posts retain traces of bark still clinging, evidence of remarkably rapid burial that arrested decomposition. Radiocarbon and dendro data together establish not only an approximate construction date but also suggest episodes of repair and reuse spanning perhaps 2 or 3 centuries later, implying long-term significance. Key discoveries clustered around the causeway are both practical and suggestive. At one mid-span node, archaeologists found a carefully stacked cache, 10 notched wooden pegs, a small bundle of cordage fragments made from plant fibers, and a single, small, polished greenstone bead, unusual because greenstone is not locally sourced and its geochemical signature points towards sources in the northeastern Appalachians. Nearby, in the packed clay shoulder, lay a scatter of fish bone dominated by sturgeon vertebrae and large catfish clythra, species whose seasonal movement up headwaters would have been predictably followed. Faunal analysis suggests a pattern. The causeway was a site of concentrated, organized aquatic harvest, possibly used at particular seasonal thresholds when fish congregated in backwater shallows. Yet the greenstone bead complicates the purely utilitarian interpretation. It hints at exchange and possibly a ceremonial overlay to otherwise practical activities. Microbotanical analysis of reed impressions preserves traces of woven matting, indicating that the causeway might have been lined with work surfaces or held structures for drying and processing fish. If we then layer on pollen data that shows an uptick in charred maize particles in layers immediately above the causeway's use horizon but not in the occupation layer itself, we sense a shift in use over time. Perhaps an initially fishing-centric structure later became a locus for seasonal trade and exchange as maize intensification spread in the region. Multiple competing theories have been proposed to explain the causeway's purpose and significance. The simplest, and for many scholars the most persuasive, treats it as infrastructure, an engineered platform allowing people to harvest and process aquatic resources with efficiency. In this model, the causeway's presence is an expression of adaptive engineering in a riverine environment, communities invested labor because the ecological return, drying and smoking sturgeon, processing catfish, and staging canoes for seasonal movement, paid off in protein and social capital. The greenstone bead, in this frame, is readable as trade garnish, an item traded in return for fish or used to mark ownership. Now, let's be fair, the engineering model must wrestle with the sheer scale of the structure relative to the small population density we infer for some nearby hamlets. It requires organization and labor pooling that suggests social complexity beyond one family group. Where would that social structure come from in a place that otherwise appears lightly settled? A second theory layers ritual and cosmological meaning onto the engineering base. In this view, the causeway is as much a sacred pathway as a practical platform, a liminal corridor leading from the everyday world into water, a domain of spirits and ancestors. The presence of deliberately placed items, like the greenstone bead buried with care, and artifactual patterns of deposition, concentrations of offerings at certain intervals along the causeway, support the argument that people treated this place differently than a mere fish processing station. Ethnohistoric analogies from other riverine indigenous cultures show that water places often host rites of passage, offerings to fish spirits, and reciprocal ceremonies to ensure good seasons. Supporters of the ritual model note the careful finishing of certain timbers, adds polished surfaces worn smooth not by use but by ritual handling, and suggests that repeated repair cycles reflect ritual maintenance rather than purely utilitarian restoration. But here's where it gets tricky: unequivocal ritual markers, such as burials set deliberately on the structure, iconography, or explicit ceremonial artifacts, are sparse. Interpreting the causeway as ritual requires reading absence as well as presence, and caution because economic and ritual practices commonly overlap in pre-industrial societies. A third hypothesis slides toward the social-political. Perhaps the causeway functioned as a staged boundary in a contested landscape, an engineered point where multiple groups came together to exchange, negotiate marriages, and perform public displays of alliance. The strategic placement into the backwater would make it a natural neutral ground, close enough to abundant resources to support gatherings but distant enough from central villages to be politically neutral. The presence of repair episodes in later centuries could reflect periodic reconvenings for treaty-making or trade fairs timed with fish runs. Supporting this, analysis of trace elements in some pottery fragments recovered near a causeway node indicate non-local clay sources, consistent with pottery arriving from at least 60 to 120 kilometers away, distances one could traverse by canoe along river corridors. That evidence dovetails with models of river-based polities whose cohesion depended heavily on managing seasonal aggregation of kin groups. Of course, political models must account for why local narratives do not remember an old fairground at the site. Absence from oral histories can happen for many reasons: displacement, deliberate forgetting, or transformations into other uses, but it remains an interpretive challenge. We must also consider environmental theories emphasizing episodic hydro events. One provocative idea is that the causeway was built in response to a specific alluvial shift or flood event. If a floodplain channel shallowed or a new backwater formed, communities could have quickly engineered a short-term causeway to stabilize access or maintain fishing grounds. Some stratigraphic layers show rapid sand deposition above certain timber elements, a pattern consistent with sudden inundation. This implies the causeway's builders were responding to acute environmental change rather than long-term planning. The dendro series showing repair episodes centuries later might therefore reflect reoccupation when river conditions again favored the site. That reading is pragmatic and resonates with how human communities adapt to dynamic water systems, but it tends to flatten the social complexity implied by the scale and finish of the construction. Then, threaded through all these scientific readings, are the myths and stories of the landscape. Older residents still tell of a long bridge that used to show at low water, a wooden spine locals called the fish walk. They speak of a night when the river swallowed a sacred walkway and of an elder who would, as a child, lift mezcal lime shells and find small beads among the mud. Some tales explicitly ascribe the causeway to a lost people who could walk on the water because they knew the rivers like a hand. Others embellish with more sensational claims: giant boards laid by giant people, a time when giants ferried stones across the state. Such stories are not archaeological proof, but they map how the community has understood the place across generations. They serve as mnemonic anchors that help people remember where to fish or avoid, and they may also preserve a memory of a major environmental rupture, a flood or a channel shift, that was experienced and narrated as a violent swallowing. Picture yourself on a late summer evening, waiting at the very edge of the reeds where the water is warmed by sun, feeling the old planks just beneath your feet as you slide a hand over algae-slick wood. Imagine the hush of a gathering, canoes drawn in, a smoke hearth set at the edge, voices low as men and women listen for the first glint of sturgeon surfacing. There is a hum to such a place, a social cadence shaped by seasons and tides. Importantly, the Causeway forces us to reckon with method and uncertainty. Preserved wood gives us precise dates via dendro, but dendrochronology is contingent on having continuous sequences and good regional master curves. Even so, the timbers returned robust match spans that placed the initial construction in a narrow window, which is rare and valuable. Yet the very things that preserve wood, rapid burial in anoxic mud, also make stratigraphic interpretation difficult when later intrusive actions disturb the deposit. Modern agricultural drainage, 20th century dredging operations, and unrecorded souvenir collection have fragmented the context. That fragmentation permits multiple plausible narratives to coexist. In response, archaeologists have deployed high-resolution micromorphology, soil chemistry mapping, and residue analysis to try to reconstruct activity areas without full excavation. Each technique sheds light on one angle and casts shadows on another, and the combined image remains necessarily partial. Reflective insight. The sunken causeway matters because it reveals how human ingenuity solves stubborn ecological problems and, just as importantly, how work and ritual can be braided together into the same built form. Whatever its original purpose, engineering, ritual, social gathering, or a mix, people invested labor to anchor their lives to a place where water and land met. That investment created a durable trace that, even after the boards fell into mud and the river shifted, left a memory in wood grain and bead chemistry. Standing beside the backwater at dusk, smelling the sweet rot of river plant matter and hearing the low trample of marsh bird, you understand how a community might gather there and breathe life into a constructed path. The Causeway insists on a lesson about human presence in dynamic landscapes. We do not merely survive environmental change, we build rituals and infrastructure that make change legible, manageable, and in some cases, sacred. And yet, after all the careful sampling and clever hypotheses, we must close this scene with the same humility we opened it with. We still don't know. Along a low sandstone scarp that overlooks a meander of the Ohio, a band of shallow carvings, cupules, grooves, and a handful of geometric panels, stitches itself along a 90-meter stretch of exposed bedrock, their shallow incisions no deeper than a fingernail but repeating in patterns that hint at counting, mapping, or a language that refuses a tidy translation. Picture the sight as if you walk up from the river, boots crunching over fossilized mussel shell, and suddenly the rock surface opens under your palm to reveal rows of repeated cups, clusters of 3 and 5, interlaced with shallow lines that occasionally form right angles. The panels measure from 0.6 to 1.8 meters across, some arranged at shoulder height, others low enough that a child could have brushed them while crawling. Stylistically, the cupules and grooves do not match the deep, pecked effigies familiar to Western rock art traditions. They are lighter, more like a notation system pressed into soft stone by intentional, rhythmic blows. The rock surface itself is Mississippian-age sandstone exposed after a riverbank cut, its grain and bedding planes influencing what could be carved. Dating rock art is notoriously difficult, but associated contexts offer clues. A hearth pit found 20 meters upslope contained charred nutshell and maize kernels whose radiocarbon calibration centers around 1250 to 1375 C, while a buried surface with small flint debitage a few meters away returned an earlier horizon of 600 to 900 C. Those overlapping time markers suggest repeated use or retouching of the rock art zone across centuries, bridging Fort ancient affinities and late Mississippian interchanges. Now, let's be fair. The presence of maize in a nearby hearth does not prove the rock art was carved by agriculturalists. but it does anchor human activity to the site at least in the second millennium C and invites us to connect the markings to the kinds of social complexity we associate with regional chiefdoms and their ritual landscapes. Key discoveries deepen the puzzle. Embedded within a shallow pocket worn into the rock, perhaps originally an intentional basin, archaeologists recovered a microassemblage, 3 work bone awls, a tiny copper hair tubule with a chemical signature pointing to the Great Lakes copper tradition, and a smooth fragment of marine shell with notches cut into one edge. Petroglyph researchers examined the notches and observed that their spacing and depth repeated a modular pattern that echoed the groove sequence found on several stones at Raven's Curve, a curious echo across sites that are, by river travel, only a few kilometers apart. In addition, lichen growth and microerosion studies performed by geoarchaeologists showed the shallow cupules had been repecked at least once after substantial surface weathering, evidence someone returned to maintain or reuse the marks. Microscopic residues sampling of one of the deeper grooves revealed traces of hematite particles, plausibly indicating intentional pigment application or iron-rich clay rubbed into the cut to increase visibility. That in itself suggests the markings were meant to be seen, by day or even by torchlight. Measurements taken of the cupule clusters show repeated groupings of 3 and 5, numbers significant in many counting systems, and one linear run of 11 evenly spaced shallow pits that align nearly precisely with the rising sun on the equinox when observed from a small knoll 3 meters to the west, a vantage point that itself contains a slight concavity suggesting a focal position. Those alignments pull us toward astronomical interpretations, although, as always, alignment does not prove intentionality. Competing theories range from the prosaic to the cosmic. One widely held scholarly interpretation treats the rock art as mnemonic landmarks, visual notes to accompany oral narratives and seasonal calendars. In this reading, the cupules encode fishing schedules, hunting counts, or clan tallies. The combination of 3 and 5 groups could represent cycles of the moon and fish runs, or counts of resource allocations after a communal harvest. Supporters of this model point to ethnographic parallels where small, repeated marks on durable surfaces function as public ledgers, counting devices visible to everyone who came to the river to bargain or to feast. Now, here's where it gets tricky. That theory must account for why the motifs recur across multiple nearby sites with slight variations, suggesting either a shared notation system or a popular aesthetic that different groups adopted for different ends. If it's a counting system, who controlled it? Was it public and communal, or was the knowledge guarded by certain families or ritual specialists? The rock art itself gives few direct answers. A second theory leans into cosmology and directs us to archaeoastronomy. The 11-pit line, the equinoctial alignment from the knoll, and the repeated patterning of 3 and 5 could encode a local lunisolar calendar used to time planting, harvest, and ceremonial gatherings. Archaeoastronomers who surveyed the site used horizon profiles and corrected for the precession of the equinoxes as well as for relative uplift and erosion, concluding that the equinoctial alignment would have been within 1 to 2 degrees of precision around 1150 to 1300 C, dates that dovetail with the maize-bearing hearth upslope. In this view, the rock surface was a public sky map, a durable way to teach young people how to read seasonal change. But let's be fair, sky matching is seductive, and many rock marks incidentally align with solar or lunar positions if one looks hard enough. Statistical caution is warranted. The alignment hypothesis gains strength when multiple, independent markers point to the same celestial event, but it weakens when the local topography or later river erosion could have shifted viewing platforms by meters, changes that could render precise alignments accidental. A third, more sensational hypothesis reaches toward contact and migration stories. Perhaps the motifs are the traces of itinerant groups, late Mississippian voyagers or even Atlantic coastal mariners, whose motifs traveled inland along trade paths and were reinterpreted locally. Supporters cite the presence of marine shell and the Great Lakes copper in the rock's pocket as material evidence for long-distance contacts. They argue that iconographic elements, like the repeated 3 and 5 motif, echo stylistic signatures seen in shell gorgets from coastal contexts. This reading encourages us to imagine a mobile, interconnected map of symbol circulation where markings on stone function as signature trademarks carried by traveling ritual specialists. Now, here's where it gets tricky again. Iconographic comparisons across regions risk cherry-picking parallels. Motifs like 3 and 5 are numerically simple and could arise independently. Without direct stylistic continuity or inscriptions, contact hypotheses remain persuasive but not conclusive. Layered through academic theories are the local stories that invest the scarp in another kind of meaning. Elders in nearby hollows will tell you the rock bears the marks of the raven, a superstition that once explained both good and bad fishing years. The little pits say when the fish will come, one old man told an interviewer in the 1970s. And if you rub them in winter, the river remembers. Children used to dare one another to sleep with their hands on the warm notches on the equinox dawn, a ritual that might be playful but points to lived knowledge of seasonal change. A few more dramatic tales speak of a lost messenger. The one who read the sky, who would stand on the knoll and call out the times for planting and warring. Such memories may be late and shaped by missionary and settler narratives, but they are also cultural residues that show how a community embeds physical marks within living practice. Imagine standing on the knoll at dawn, watching the thin line of light spread across the river, feeling the cool of the stone underfoot as the sunlight creeps into the 11 pits and makes them glow like small mouths. Imagine a figure from 1,000 years ago standing in the same place, teaching a child to count the pits and to time the planting of corn. That shared scene across centuries is a kind of continuity archaeology struggles to prove but cannot quite ignore. Methodologically, the rock art pushes the limits of our dating tools and interpretive patience. Iconometry, microerosion models, and sediment builds can give broad ranges, but the absolute dating of carving events remains elusive without organic residues sealed beneath or within the carved grooves. The nearby hearths and the embedded artifacts give context, but context is not the same as direct attribution. Scholars have suggested experimental archaeologies, recreating cupules with period tools to measure wear rates, comparing residue signatures, and performing blind statistical tests to see how likely alignments are by chance. Each method trims the space of plausible interpretations, but none draws a single, unambiguous picture. The geometry of the marks, repetition, spacing, and modest scale, makes them powerful socially even while it resists grand theoretical closure. Reflective insight. The petroglyph scarp matters because it encapsulates how small marks can hold big meanings. The cupules are not monuments on the scale of mounds, but they are tactile, teachable surfaces, places where memory could be carved and refreshed again and again. Whether they recorded moon cycles, served as public ledgers, or enshrined itinerant symbols from distant coasts, their durability made them anchors in a landscape otherwise subject to river change and human movement. Standing there, fingers in the shallow hollows, you sense the continuity of counting hands across time. Someone, somewhere, decided that a cluster of 3, a run of 11, aligned to the equinox, would be worth carving into stone and keeping. The inscription is small, but the intent is large, to make time legible, communal, and public. And after surveying grooves, micro-residues, and horizon lines, we must end the scene with the same honest restraint good inquiry requires. We still don't know. We have walked these places together now, the quiet bend where the raven's curved stones keep a slow, stubborn count, the half-buried causeway that threads the backwater like an old spine of the river, the scarp whose cupules and careful grooves catch the equinox light, and in each place the same set of questions returns, like a tide you can't quite predict but learn to read. What binds these sites is less a single culture or a tidy timeline than a pattern of attention, people paying attention to water and sky, to season and migration, people investing labor into markers that would outlast a lifetime, people making meaning from the landscape in ways that were practical, ritual, social, and stubbornly human. Across the centuries, the Ohio has been a highway and a library at once, carrying not only fish and canoes but ideas, shells from the coast, copper from the lakes, stories that hitchhiked on trade and marriage, and the shared needs of people who learned to read the river's moods. When a scholar reads a radiocarbon chart, and another reads an elder's tale, they are both listening to the same landscape, only in different languages. The truth is never singular here. It is layered and overlapping, a palimpsest of pushes and repairs, of ritual returns and hurried engineering born of floods. That is the most honest and, I think, the most beautiful conclusion we can draw. These mysteries matter because they show how human beings, across centuries, inscribed their needs and hopes into the same places, and in doing so left us a map that is partly fact and partly invitation. If archaeology gives us dates and materials and stratigraphies, it gives us something else too, a habit of humility. The labs can tell us when a beam was cut to the nearest decade, when a charcoal fleck burned, what a bead's chemical signature betrays about its geological origin, but they can't, on their own, tell us why a particular stone line was maintained across generations or why a causeway was repaired again and again after floods. Oral histories fill those gaps, not by supplying laboratory precision but by preserving continuities of meaning. An elder's phrase about the ones who counted the nights is not an archaeological datum in the strict sense, but it is the shadow of a social practice, how people taught rhythm, time, and responsibility to each other. Combining those shadows and measurements is where our best explanations live, and it is where we must remain careful, to honor the rigor of evidence while admitting that some truths will always live partly in story. When those two modes of knowing, scientific and narrative, are allowed to converse, they make room for hypotheses that are richer and more humane. Think of the sites not as puzzles to be solved and shelved, but as conversations across time, invitations to step into someone else's reckoning of sky and river. We have also been invited to reckon with the ways landscapes change and how that complicates our reading of the past. Rivers meander, channels cut new courses, oxbows form and are reclaimed. What was once a visible marker on a shoreline can be stranded inland or submerged entirely. That movement is more than a geomorphological note, it is historical pressure. A set of stones that once aligned to a river's edge might be repurposed as a ritual avenue when floodplain shifts make the old shoreline a field. A wooden causeway, intended to anchor canoes in a predictable backwater, may be swallowed overnight by a flood and remembered thereafter as a tale of swallowing and loss. Those environmental vicissitudes mean that interpreting a site as ritual, or practical, is often a false dichotomy. The practical may have ritual valence because labor and life are invested in it. The ritual may be practical because it manages resources and cements alliances. The interplay of environment and human intention is messy and elegant. It demands of us a kind of interpretive choreography that balances the hard numbers of science against the pliant shapes of human memory. One of the clearest lessons across the sites is the significance of exchange, not simply trade in goods but exchange in ideas and symbols. The greenstone bead recovered in the causeway, the copper hairtubule in the scarp pocket, the shell notches shared across sites. These artifacts are evidence of movement, of objects that traveled and carried meaning. Such items suggest networks stretching far beyond the immediate valley, and that mobility carries with it stylistic echoes, counting marks that resemble one another, ritual practices that mirror one another at nodes along the river. Mobility also carries complexity. When people move and ideas travel, meanings mutate. A motif that starts as a clan symbol on a coastal gorget might be adapted inland as a mnemonic for fish runs. A counting groove might be reinterpreted as a ritual accent when the context shifts. That is how cultures evolve, through the slow, sometimes haphazard transference of things and the deliberate reinterpretation of marks. Rather than seeking a single origin for a motif, we should celebrate the multivalent life of symbols as they cross canoes and time. And of course myths and giants and the language of wonder thread through this archaeology because humans are story animals. Legends about giants laying down planks or stones that sing at midnight are not evidence in the laboratory sense, but they are evidence in the human sense. They are how communities have made meaning of extraordinary experiences: floods, mass die-offs of fish, the arrival of strange goods. When elders tell of a lost people who could walk the water, perhaps they encode memories of a major environmental change or an encounter with travelers who moved differently than locals did. Perhaps they keep alive the reverence for a place where important exchanges happened. Myths compress experience into memorable, often moral forms. They are mnemonic machines that help communities remember and transmit knowledge across generations. We must treat these stories with respect, not because they provide ironclad proof of archaeological hypotheses, but because they offer a human key to the ways people felt about and used these places. There is also a political edge to this work that we should not soften. Sites like these have been catalogued, excavated, interpreted, and sometimes plundered in contexts dominated by outside narratives of discovery. That history matters. The people who walk these stones are not merely objects of historical curiosity. They have descendants, communities that still live in the region and whose lives are shaped by how we handle the past. Ethical archaeology, then, must be collaborative, scientists working with local stewards, museums returning objects when appropriate, and narratives that include indigenous voices and contemporary communities. The humanities, sciences, and local storytellers together can hold the past without flattening it into an external curiosity. That ethical posture is part of how these mysteries should be treated going forward, carefully, humbly, and with a willingness to share authority. What, finally, do we owe the future as we leave these stones and timbers and grooves behind in our account? We owe them curiosity that is clear-eyed and generous. We owe them patience with ambiguity. We owe them better than simplistic answers that fit neat stories of lost civilizations or giants without evidence. And we also owe them the imagination to picture scenes that science cannot fully reconstruct: the sound of a procession along a river, the hush of people counting in the rain, the faint sheen of shell in the mud where offerings were once laid. Archaeology, at its best, is both a science and an act of empathy. It reconstructs the factual bones of human activity while also trying to feel the human pulse that made those bones meaningful. When we stand in the mud by a partially exposed plank or run our finger across a faint notch in sandstone, we are doing more than collecting data. We are tuning ourselves to the long human frequency that resonated through this valley. So the ending is not a single solved mystery but a set of open doors. Raven's Curve asks us to consider continuity and reuse. The Sunken Causeway teaches us about adaptation and communal labor. The scarp's cupules remind us that small marks can be public and pedagogical. Together they form a chorus, an argument for complexity over closure, for curiosity over certainty. They ask us to honor multiple ways of knowing, to hold science and story together in a tensile embrace that respects evidence and remembers that people everywhere make meaning from the same raw materials: stone, wood, river, sky, and each other. If you leave Point Pleasant with anything, let it be not a tidy explanation but a readiness to live with wonder grounded by careful inquiry. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.